perfect suburban dream turns into a nightmare. Buying a home is one of the most significant milestones in anyone's life. It's the culmination of years of hard work, savings, and dreams of a peaceful, comfortable life. The idea of owning a home in a suburban neighborhood, surrounded by friendly neighbors, beautiful lawns, and a sense of tranquility, can feel like the ultimate American dream. For most people, it's an escape from the chaos of city life, a chance to build a future without the stress of constant noise and overcrowding. This was the vision I had when I moved into my new house. Oakwood Acres, a picturesque neighborhood known for its well-kept homes, tree-lined streets, and a reputation for having the best-kept lawns in the county, seemed like the perfect place to settle down. A place where you could enjoy a cup of coffee on the porch in the morning and take long evening walks without worrying about the hustle and bustle of the city. It was a sanctuary away from the noise, the traffic, and the chaos that had defined my earlier years in the fast-paced city life. I had always been someone who preferred to mind my own business, keeping to myself and avoiding unnecessary drama. The neighborhood seemed perfect in every way, and the Homeowners Association, HOA, was just another part of the deal, something I thought I would simply ignore. After all, I had heard the horror stories about HOAs overstepping their bounds, but I had assumed that as long as I followed basic community rules, I would be left to live peacefully in my own space. But I was wrong. It didn't take long for me to realize that the HOA in Oakwood Acres wasn't just a group of well-meaning neighbors looking out for the community's best interests. No, this HOA president had a different agenda. Her name was Marissa, and she had a way of making everyone in the neighborhood feel like they were being watched, controlled, and even manipulated into following her strict standards. At first, I tried to avoid getting involved. I kept my head down, maintained my yard, and didn't engage with her or the HOA. I thought, if I don't give them any reason to bother me, they won't. But, as we all know, when it comes to powerful personalities like Marissa, the problem is never about staying under the radar. People like her won't leave you alone unless you completely conform to their vision. I had always respected my personal boundaries and values, and I wasn't about to change for anyone. However, I didn't expect things to escalate so quickly. It all began with small things: letters in my mailbox, complaints about my lawn not being up to community standards. My trees, in particular, were a frequent target. They were tall, old, and had been part of the landscape for decades, adding to the beauty of the property. To Marissa, however, they didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should look like. So began the subtle nudges. Polite letters from the HOA, friendly reminders about the importance of keeping my property in line with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. I ignored them. It wasn't until one fateful day when I returned home from work that things took a dramatic turn. When I pulled into my driveway, the scene before me stopped me in my tracks. The familiar green of my property, my pride and joy, was gone. The trees, the ones that had been there for generations, the ones that had provided shade and privacy for years, were gone. My heart sank as I stared at the ground littered with stumps, broken branches, and remnants of what was once a vibrant part of my home. It was as though a piece of my soul had been ripped out. And the worst part? There was no warning, no permission, no explanation. The HOA had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. I stood there in stunned silence as I took in the damage. The smell of freshly cut wood lingered in the air, a reminder of the destruction that had just been wreaked upon my property. As my anger started to simmer, I noticed a truck parked down the street, emblazoned with the HOA logo. That's when it hit me. Marissa, the HOA president, had orchestrated this. She had come onto my property and ordered the removal of my trees, all under the guise of maintaining community standards. I was furious, but more than that, I was coldly calculating. I knew what had happened wasn't just a petty violation. It wasn't an innocent misunderstanding. This was an attack on my home, on my property, and on my rights. And what Marissa didn't know was that she had just messed with the wrong person. You see, I wasn't just any homeowner in this neighborhood. I wasn't a person who could be intimidated or pushed around by power-hungry HOA presidents. I was a federal judge. I had spent years in the courtroom, upholding the law and ensuring that justice was served. And when someone broke the law in front of me, I didn't hesitate to act. This wouldn't be a petty argument about aesthetics or landscaping. This was about legal accountability. The realization hit me hard. The destruction I was staring at was not just an unfortunate incident. It was a violation of my legal rights, and I wasn't going to let this slide. Not without consequences. How a federal judge handles HOA tyranny. Now, I could have reacted impulsively, storming over to Marissa's house and confronting her in the heat of the moment. But I knew better than that. As a judge, I understood the power of patience and control. I wasn't going to allow myself to get caught up in an emotional outburst that would give her the upper hand. No, I was going to handle this the right way. I walked over to the HOA truck, trying to keep my composure. When Marissa stepped out of the passenger seat, her confident smile quickly turned into something more calculated, as if she were anticipating my anger. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of a public outburst. I kept my voice calm and controlled. "You cut down my trees," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "Without my permission. And now you're going to face the consequences." Her initial reaction was one of surprise, but she quickly regained her composure. "We were just maintaining the community standards. Your trees were out of line," she explained, her voice dripping with condescension. I nodded slightly, pretending to consider her explanation. Then, with all the calm authority I could muster, I responded, "You trespassed on my property, damaged my property, and violated my rights. And you did it all without permission. You don't just have an aesthetic problem, you have a legal problem." For the first time, I saw her confidence waver. It was almost palpable, the moment she realized she had crossed the wrong person. But I wasn't finished yet. "You've broken the law," I said, "and now you're going to pay for it." At that moment, I knew that this wasn't just about trees. It wasn't just about an HOA president overstepping her bounds. This was about legal accountability and ensuring that power was never abused without consequence. I was going to make sure that Marissa and the entire HOA faced the full force of the law. The legal showdown, how a federal judge dismantles the HOA. The days following the destruction of my trees were filled with a mix of anger and purpose. I knew that if I wanted to make Marissa and her HOA pay for their actions, I had to approach this methodically. As a federal judge, I had spent years making decisions that impacted people's lives, and I knew that the law would be my strongest weapon. But first, I needed to gather the evidence to prove that the HOA had overstepped its bounds, violated my rights, and caused irreversible harm to my property. I started by reviewing the security footage from my home's cameras. I had installed them a few years ago after a break-in scare, but now they would serve a much greater purpose. The footage clearly showed the HOA truck entering my property without permission. The workers, at Marissa's behest, had cut down every tree I had planted or nurtured. The images of my trees being chopped down were irrefutable proof of trespass and property damage. But I needed more. I called my assistant and instructed her to pull all the HOA's records from the city's public archives. I knew that, as a homeowner, I wasn't legally required to follow the HOA's aesthetic rules. I had never signed any agreements binding me to their control, and after a quick check into the city's ordinances, I found that my property wasn't under their jurisdiction. They had no legal right to even step onto my land, let alone destroy my property. This was a critical finding. The law was on my side, and now I had the documents to prove it. But I didn't want to just stop at proving that they had broken the law. I wanted to expose the entire system of corruption and abuse within this HOA, something that I had suspected all along but never had the proof to back up. I began to dig deeper into the HOA's finances. What I found was astounding. Large payments had been made to landscaping companies that never did any work, and significant sums of money were being funneled into personal accounts. The HOA's treasurer, who also happened to be a close friend of Marissa's, had signed off on these dubious transactions. This wasn't just a case of overreaching authority. This was outright embezzlement. I knew that if I could bring this information to light, the entire HOA board would be exposed. But before I made my next move, I wanted to test the waters. The HOA had been growing increasingly desperate as the tension in the neighborhood grew. Marissa's once unshakable confidence was starting to crack. I knew that if I applied just the right pressure, she would fold. I didn't have to wait long. A few days later, I received a letter from the HOA, full of excuses and half-hearted apologies. They claimed that the trees had been a hazard, that they were removed to maintain community standards, and that they regretted any inconvenience caused. But the final line of the letter, the one that really got me, stated that I could be fined if I tried to plant new trees without HOA approval. They still thought they were in control. I laughed as I read the letter, shaking my head. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I kept the letter. It would be useful in court, but it also served as a reminder that Marissa and her board weren't just overstepping their authority. They were too arrogant to realize they had crossed the wrong person. I had every intention of holding them accountable for their illegal actions. As a federal judge, I had dealt with high-profile cases involving organized crime, white-collar criminals, and corrupt officials. This HOA was no different. The tactics they used were textbook examples of how people in power manipulate systems for personal gain. Marissa had underestimated my ability to expose her corruption. I wasn't just going to get my trees back. I was going to dismantle the entire HOA. I started reaching out to neighbors who had also expressed frustration with the HOA. Some of them were already angry about the increased fees and unexplained charges. Others had been intimidated into silence, afraid of retaliation. But as soon as I showed them the financial documents, proof of embezzlement and fraud, the revolt began. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now rallying against the HOA's corruption. That same day, I got a phone call from one of my neighbors, asking me for help. The HOA has raised our fees again, but they never do anything with that money, he said, his voice filled with frustration. They won't even fix the streetlights, but they keep sending us bills for it. This was just the beginning. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. People started to question where their money was really going. The power of community solidarity became evident. Marissa, who had once paraded around the neighborhood like a queen, was now avoiding the very streets she used to control. The walls were closing in. But I wasn't done yet. The next phase of my plan was to file an official complaint with the city about the illegal removal of the trees. This set off an environmental investigation, which led to government inspectors visiting my property. They took photos, analyzed the damage, and confirmed that the trees couldn't have been removed without proper authorization. The HOA was now facing the possibility of hefty fines, and more importantly, public scrutiny. I forwarded all the financial fraud documentation to the government auditing department, knowing that the investigation would cause a ripple effect that Marissa wouldn't be able to escape. In the meantime, the neighborhood was becoming increasingly polarized. People who had once feared the HOA were now coming together, demanding answers. The next HOA meeting, which had been scheduled to address the growing concerns, became a flashpoint. Marissa thought she could smooth things over with a few empty apologies. What she didn't realize was that the community was no longer under her control. The battle lines had been drawn. The final blow, exposing corruption and restoring justice. The HOA president, Marissa, could not hide her nervousness as the day of the meeting approached. The once certain leader of the neighborhood was now reduced to a woman on the defensive, trying desperately to maintain control of a situation that was slipping further away from her. The community's support for her was crumbling, and even her most loyal allies could sense the inevitable collapse. This was a moment that had been building for weeks. A moment when the truth would be exposed, and the power that Marissa had so arrogantly wielded would be stripped away. I wasn't one for grand gestures, and I had no intention of making this a spectacle. My goal was simple: to hold Marissa and the HOA accountable for their crimes. As a federal judge, I knew the importance of timing. I had laid the groundwork, gathered the evidence, and built the case. Now it was time to strike. The HOA meeting was scheduled to take place in the community's small events room, a location where residents had once gathered for neighborhood potlucks and planning sessions. But now, it was a space filled with tension and uncertainty. People who had been silent for years were speaking up, and the air was thick with anticipation. As I entered the room, I could feel the weight of the moment. Marissa, standing at the front of the room, tried her best to maintain an air of authority. But the cracks in her demeanor were evident. Her usual confidence had vanished. replaced by a sense of desperation. She attempted to calm the growing unrest in the room by offering vague explanations about operational difficulties and misunderstandings regarding the HOA's finances. But the crowd wasn't buying it. She tried to address the issue of the trees first. As I've said before, she began, the removal of the trees was necessary for the community's safety and aesthetics. It was a decision made in the best interest of Oakwood Acres. The room erupted into murmurs of disbelief, with several residents shaking their heads. One of my neighbors, a man who had been on the HOA's mailing list for years but never dared to question them, stood up and asked, "If it was about safety, why were we never consulted? Why didn't you even ask before cutting down the trees?" Marissa's face reddened as she fumbled for a response. But I knew it was my moment to act. I stood up calmly, and for the first time since this ordeal began, all eyes were on me. "If you want to talk about transparency, let's talk about transparency," I said, placing a stack of documents on the table in front of the board members. "Let's talk about where the money has been going. Let's talk about the hundreds of thousands of dollars that have disappeared into accounts that have nothing to do with the neighborhood's maintenance." I could feel the shift in the room. The atmosphere, once charged with uncertainty, suddenly felt heavy with disbelief. The documents I laid out on the table weren't just random bits of paper. They were hard evidence, proof of the financial mismanagement, fraud, and embezzlement that had been going on right under our noses. Payments made to non-existent landscaping companies, vast sums of money disappearing without any legitimate explanation. These were the things that Marissa and her board members had hoped would stay hidden. But now the truth was laid bare for all to see. "You see," I continued, my voice steady and calm, "the HOA didn't just illegally cut down my trees. They've been draining the neighborhood's finances for years. And it's time for all of you to face the consequences of that. This is no longer a petty dispute over trees. This is about financial fraud, misappropriation of funds, and abuse of power." Marissa's face went pale as she realized the magnitude of the situation. For the first time, she was facing the consequences of her actions. But I wasn't done yet. I turned to the documents I had gathered from the city's environmental office. "Here is confirmation from the town hall," I said, holding up the report. "The trees were removed illegally, without proper authorization, and as you can see, the HOA will face significant fines for their actions." The room was now in an uproar. People who had once felt powerless in the face of Marissa's authority were now rising up. They demanded explanations, they demanded justice. And for the first time, Marissa didn't have any answers. Her bravado had completely vanished. The very system she had spent years controlling had turned against her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Just as I had predicted, her phone rang in the middle of the chaos. She stepped aside to answer it, her face already visibly upset. It didn't take long for everyone in the room to notice the terror spreading across her face. The phone call was the final nail in the coffin. The government had officially frozen the HOA's funds, and an investigation was underway. A lawsuit was being filed against the association for their fraudulent activities. I could feel a sense of vindication wash over me. This wasn't just about reclaiming my trees. This was about bringing down an entire corrupt system that had been exploiting residents for years. The battle wasn't just mine. It was a collective victory for every single person who had been bullied and manipulated by Marissa and her cronies. The HOA was officially dissolved shortly after the meeting. Marissa, humiliated and defeated, was forced to sell her house. Rumor had it that she moved to the other side of the country, trying to escape the shame of her actions. But the damage to her reputation was done. The community she had once ruled with an iron fist was now free from her grasp. The aftermath, rebuilding the community. With the HOA gone, Oakwood Acres was a different place. The community that had once been divided and controlled by fear was now united in the pursuit of fairness and transparency. The residents elected a new board, one that prioritized the well-being of the community over personal power. The first meeting of the new board was held at my house, where we discussed how to move forward as a neighborhood. No more fees for services that were never rendered. No more arbitrary rules that served only to control and punish. This was a fresh start, and we were determined to make sure that the mistakes of the past never happened again. As for me, I stayed in my home. Despite the destruction of my trees, I felt a sense of peace. Not because of the victory, but because I knew that justice had prevailed. I had stood up to corruption, and together with my neighbors, we had brought down a system of power that had been exploiting us for years. In the end, I didn't need to shout or threaten. I just used the law, the most powerful tool we have against those who abuse their power. And every time I look at my yard, now filled with new, healthy trees, I don't feel anger. I feel pride. Because what was once destroyed has now been rebuilt, not just physically, but within the very spirit of the community. Final thoughts and reflections. This story is a powerful reminder that justice isn't always about immediate retribution or emotional outbursts. Sometimes it's about using the right tools, patience, strategy, and the law to dismantle corruption and bring accountability to those who think they are above it. The victory wasn't just about personal satisfaction. It was about restoring a sense of fairness and community to a place that had been exploited for far too long. In the end, the law wasn't just an abstract concept. It was the mechanism through which real change was made. And for that, I will always be proud. If this story has inspired you and shown you the power of standing up to corruption, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire courage, fairness, and justice. Whether it's a personal battle with authority, corruption in your community, or simply feeling like you're being treated unfairly, remember that you have the tools to fight back. Like the protagonist in this story, you can use knowledge, strategy, and the law to make sure justice is served, and often, that's all it takes to bring down the most seemingly untouchable forces. If you've ever felt like the system was stacked against you, this is your reminder that the law can be your greatest ally in ensuring accountability and fairness. It doesn't matter how big or small the issue might seem. When you stand your ground and use the power of information and law, change is possible. Backhand index pointing right. Comment below if you've ever faced a situation where you had to stand up to authority or unfair systems. Share your experience with us, and let's continue the conversation about how to protect our rights and communities. Let's raise awareness, support each other, and fight for a fairer world. Justice may not always come easily, but it is always worth the fight. Don't forget to share this video with anyone you know who might need a little inspiration to take action. Because together, we can dismantle systems of injustice and create a fairer, more transparent world for all. Thank you for watching, and remember, never back down from what's right, no matter who you're up against. Stay strong, stay informed, and keep fighting for justice.